Okay, so yesterday we saw a look at Islam. We saw Islam through the eyes of Muslims. We understood the religion as it's practiced as far as the 5 pillars are concerned, the 6 articles of faith. We got a pretty good introduction to all that. You heard my testimony, my personal walk, and how the Lord brought me to the truth. And we got a quick look into Sharia, into Hadith, etc. All that was so that you can have a basis to understand Muslims in the way they think, the way they see the world, to see the world through their eyes. It really, really matters. When you are trying to share the gospel with someone, when you're trying to convince them of anything, you need to be able to understand what they see and how they see it in order to be convincing. We can't assume certain things that aren't there. We can't assume they think the way we think. We can't assume that they see things the way we do. Of course, every Muslim is different, and some of them are extremely westernized and individualistic, and a lot of them are more traditional in their approach. So yesterday should have given you a good smattering of the perceptions that Muslims have. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at some of the more critical issues regarding Islamic studies. Now, I focus again on the origins of Islam. I focus on Muhammad. I focus on the Quran. The rest of Islam, very intriguing, very interesting, a rich tapestry of history. But it does not have the same apologetic emphasis that the origins of Islam has. And so we're going to be focusing on the origins. We're going to be taking a brief look at scholarship. So we're going to be looking at approaches to Islamic studies and the origins that are there. And then we're going to be considering our approach in light of the various approaches that are out there in scholarship. Then we're going to take a look at the historical Muhammad. We're going to look at his life, what we can know, and given certain approaches, what our conclusions would be. And then we're going to spend the majority of our time tonight looking at the Quran, the history, understanding its composition, compilation, from a critical as well as a Muslim perspective. Now, I did get a little feedback yesterday insofar as the breaks were perhaps a bit too short. We will be taking a bit longer breaks, so hopefully your bladders will be well maintained. Don't want to risk that. So let's take a brief look at scholarship. Where I'm pulling this from is from Fred Donner's narratives of Islamic origins. So this is basically his summary of the way Islamic studies have gone, critical Islamic studies. This is not definitive by any means, but I find it to be a good description of the way Islamic studies have evolved over the past few centuries. Now, what you had from the inception of Islam all the way until about the 17th century were, as far as Western non-Muslim scholarship was concerned, was a lot of criticism of Islam, a lot of total ignoring of their sources. No one really looked at the Islamic history from the Muslim perspective. No one looked at the Hadith. No one looked at the Sirah. They were pretty much recounting Islam's history from their own perspective. And there was a breakthrough in studies which Fred Donner calls the descriptive approach. Starting in about the 17th century, people started using the Islamic narrative in order to discuss Muhammad's life, the life of the caliphs after that, and the progression of Islam. So the first approach that we'll be looking at is this, the descriptive approach. And it was a breakthrough in its time. Now, there are 3 main assumptions of the descriptive approach to Islamic studies. The first is that the Quran is practically documentary in its value. In other words, the Quran, what you read from the Quran tells us exactly what Muhammad was like. It tells us what he said. It is the earliest source. Looking at it chronologically, the Quran came in the early 7th century, and so if we read the Quran, we will have word for word what Muhammad taught. We will have a good idea of what people responded to him with. The issues, the problems that existed in his community, the Quran will give us a good understanding of that. Does that make sense, how that approach would work? And a lot of people adhere to that today. In addition to this, the descriptive approach also took the general contours of the Islamic narrative into account. In other words, the general framework of how Islam came to be today. That Muhammad came at about the year 570, and that after 40 years, in 610 AD, he started his ministry. It became public 3 years later, and then he had this hijrah in 622, and then he died in 632, and then the caliphs came after that. This general contour, this narrative of Islam, is reported in Islamic sources, the akhbar, the reports. And this was assumed by the descriptive approach to be generally trustworthy. Now, as far as the hadith are concerned, specific details, specific statements that are made by Muhammad, etc., the descriptive approach discounted those. They said, well, those are more so of a religious nature. They're more of a liturgical nature. We don't actually trust that for historical value. If it weren't for that caveat, by the way, if it weren't for the fact that the descriptive approach didn't really give historical credibility to the hadith, it would be pretty much analogous, parallel to Islamic approaches. This is as close as critical scholarship gets to Islamic scholarship. The main difference here between the two is that this discounts the historical nature of the hadith. Now, this is a very attractive way to take a look at the Islamic sources and to look into Islamic history. It's very attractive because most people who study Islamic studies are very used to the Islamic narrative. That's what they've heard, that's what they've read, that's how they were introduced to the field. And that's what most of the Muslim scholars believe and subscribe to. And so using the descriptive approach has this appeal of being able to create common ground and have a similar understanding of history along with the traditional Muslim scholars. So the descriptive approach has that advantage, and insofar as apologetics is concerned, if you're going to be discussing Islamic history with a Muslim, this is going to be the strongest platform. This is going to be the strongest bridge you can have, the descriptive approach. Does anyone have any questions? Is anyone completely lost?
I still don't understand the difference between what was prior to the descriptive approach and then how that really differs.
So before we had the descriptive approach, according to Fred Donner, people were not using the Islamic narrative at all. They were going off of extra non-Muslim sources in order to reconstruct the early history of Islam. They gave no credence whatsoever to the akhbar. And here you have the Islamic narrative, which gives you the contours of the Islamic history. And that really started in the 17th century, 18th century. Sir? Right, so the hadith are, and we'll do a recap for those of you who might not have been here yesterday. The hadith are the statements of Muhammad. So the things that Muhammad said. Often subsumed into that concept are the sunnah, or the things that Muhammad did. These statements are recorded hundreds of years after Muhammad. They were not contemporary with him. Oral tradition is what prevailed between Muhammad's time and the hadith. And so it wasn't until about a few hundred years later that these were written down. And we'll take a look at that very briefly. So we'll be going into that a little bit more. But you do need to know that at this point. The hadith are the statements and traditions of Muhammad recorded by Muslims approximately a few hundred years after Muhammad. Any other questions before we move on? Good, so you all have a good understanding of what we're doing, the enterprise we're engaged in right now, how to look at the sources, how to look at early Islamic studies. The descriptive approach soon gave way to a source-critical approach. And for those of you who've done New Testament or biblical studies, you'll understand the source-critical approach. Basically, the idea here was that there are so many contradictions in the hadith and the narratives even, in the akhbar, that they cannot be overlooked. They say something about the origins of Islamic history. And so what we ought to be able to do is take a look at these sources and try to arrange them accordingly. Which ones are earlier? Which ones are more trustworthy? Which ones give you a better picture of what actually happened? So the source-critical approach would assume a few things. First, that the narrative reports are mixed with unhistorical information, though the historical kernel is still retrievable. In other words, the akhbar, the reports, are generally based off of some truth, and we can ascertain what that truth is, but there's a lot of untruth mixed in there. That's one of the assumptions of the source-critical approach to Islamic studies. Another assumption is that early non-Muslim sources can be used to determine the reliability of Muslim accounts. So we have well over 100 early sources on Islam that are not from Muslims. If you're interested in that, read Hoyland's Seeing Islam as Others Saw It. He lists out all 120. And he gives a good understanding of what they said. Generally nothing super detailed, nothing super comprehensive, little intersections of Islam with Western society is usually what most of those are. The source-critical approach did, however, maintain two assumptions from the descriptive approach, which is that the Quran is virtually documentary in its use. It still tells you the things that happened from the 7th century in Muhammad's time, and that the hadith are religious in nature and they are not trustworthy. Now, the main advantage to the source-critical approach was that it understood the contradictory accounts as dogmatic or political in origin. So it wasn't just saying there are contradictions, we can't trust it. It was saying these contradictions are derived from political agendas or for dogmatic reasons. So it gave a more rigorous treatment of the sources. It brought a fuller understanding to the picture of early Islam. The source-critical approach therefore enlightened a lot, but it had one fatal flaw, which was that it assumed that the sources for Islam were written. And that was something that the tradition-critical approach rectified. The tradition-critical approach, which is the third approach here, understands that the sources were not written for a long, long time. The source-critical approach, when you're doing source criticism, you're looking at and comparing documents, and you're assuming that certain documents edited one or another, or certain changes were made. But the tradition-critical approach understood the dynamics of oral tradition and took it into account. So that was one of the first points of the tradition-critical approach, and it really did change the face of Islamic studies. It was inaugurated by Ignaz Goldziher, who demonstrated that many traditions, even the sound ones from the Hadith, were actually reflections of later interests which rejected onto Muhammad. So what Goldziher did was he took a look at the Hadith that Muslims considered mutawatir, or the most sound. And these are the ones that traditionally Muslim scholars said are beyond reproach. These are the best Hadith that there are. They're the most trustworthy, the most accurate. And he would compare those. And he would compare the isnad, and he would look through. Don't forget, the isnad is a chain of transmission for the Hadith. He would compare them, and he would show that the isnad would actually grow over time. As traditions progressed in time, the isnads grew further and further back to the point of Muhammad himself. And he would point out, look, these traditions are growing over time. They're not trustworthy, even the most solid ones, even the most sound ones. And by pointing this out, he was able to demonstrate that there is very little we can trust in the Hadith sources as far as the historical kernel that's there. Now, he did still believe that there is historical fact to be gleaned from these ahadith, but it's just extremely difficult to do. So his main contribution was that he called into question the whole corpus of Hadith literature. And he therefore rejects the documentary hypothesis of the source-critical approach. In other words, you cannot really compare one source to another in order to see which one's more accurate. You have to use other means. What those means were, he didn't fully explicate, and it was very difficult for scholars at that point to move forward because he made such a powerful case. Now, if you're going to go into Islamic studies at all, you will encounter Goldziher, and you should understand his work. He wrote a lot, and he pretty much is the origin of current Islamic studies. Now, the tradition-critical approach was... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is he Muslim himself?
No, he is German.
Didn't see him.
Yeah, he is not someone that Muslims like generally. Now, the tradition-critical approach was so effective in raising the historical kernel of the ahadith and the akhbar that it gave way to the fourth approach, which is called the skeptical approach. The skeptical approach basically says whether there is a historical kernel of truth or not in these hadith, we can't know, and it's kind of irrelevant because we can't extract it even if it were there. There's no real way to know the history of Islam from these records. Joseph Schacht, from about the 40s and 50s, his work on Islamic jurisprudence was probably the most effective in writing out this position. He states, even the classical corpus contains a great many traditions that cannot possibly be authentic. All efforts to extract from this often self-contradictory mass an authentic core historic intuition, as it has been called, has failed. In other words, there is no way to extract historic information from the hadith, from the traditions of Muhammad. The skeptical approach has also made one further move away from the source critical and tradition critical approach, in that they see no reason to think the Quran is actually documentary. Many of the scholars from the skeptical approach have concluded the Quran is actually much later than the 7th century. John Wansborough is probably the most famous of the skeptical scholars here. And his work, he concluded that the Quran was written 3 centuries after it's assumed. So he says about the 9th, 10th century is when the Quran was written. If you try to read his work, I can guarantee you it will be a headache. If I were you, I would suggest reading Andrew Rippin. Andrew Rippin, he's a scholar up in Canada, and he is the easiest way to understand Wansborough. But there are other scholars from this tradition. Lamens, who's listed first there, he's actually a Christian apologist, and because of his status as a Christian apologist, his work never took off. I don't know if you realize this, but in critical studies, most people take a look at apologists and consider them biased and their work inappropriate just because they are apologists. And so Lamens' work, even though most people recognize that the erudition was unbelievable and astonishing, Donner calls it astonishing. He's an extremely intelligent man. Just the fact that he was pro-Christianity as overtly as he was, and anti-Islam as overtly as he was, made his work get called into question. He really did champion the criterion of embarrassment, by the way. So if you're used to New Testament studies and some of the works by Mike Licona, etc., Lamens was using that to come up with a lot of his conclusions. Schacht, we've talked about. Patricia Crona is considered one of the foremost skeptical scholars. She wrote, along with Michael Cook, not David Cook from Rice, a different Cook, she wrote the theory for Hagerism, which is that Islam is basically a heterodox or a heretical Christian cult. Very interesting work. No one buys it, but it does shape Islamic studies now. This last name that I mentioned here, John Burton, I mentioned him yesterday. He is quite a character. His work was very, very interesting in that he called into question very effectively the process of the jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence. Basically, his position was that you had different areas in the Islamic empire where different schools of thought were vying for superiority. And so they would invent hadith to defend their positions. However, in other areas, there were people who gave more precedence to the Quran over the hadith. And so they'd invent Quranic verses that they said were then later removed. So they'd say, here was a Quranic verse, but it's been removed, but you're still supposed to follow it. So Burton points out that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, he says that's where the doctrine of abrogation originated, was people saying verses of the Quran have been abrogated, but the tradition is still to be followed. And they were using that to advance their own school of thought. Very interesting position. He concludes, and in an astounding display of poor logic, he concludes that the Quran goes back to Muhammad's time, that Muhammad himself compiled the entire Quran as it's found today. He provides no positive evidence for this. He just says that there's no negative evidence against it. So it's an argument from silence through and through. That conclusion of his, which he tries to make the climax of his book, has been rejected by most of scholarship. But his insight into the origins of these hadith, the traditions, the jurisprudence, and the growth of traditions that were contrary to one another and these abrogation issues, those insights are very profound. And if you can get through his book and read all of that, that's powerful stuff. So if you wanted to be conversant in current skeptical scholarship on Islam, even critical scholarship in general, these would be the characters to read. Maybe not Lamens, but definitely the other 4. JW.
You mentioned the one other that was an easier version of Wansborough. Could you...
Andrew Rippin, R-I-P-P-I-N. He even says himself he made his career off of interpreting Wansborough. He's in Vancouver, I believe. Good stuff. He's written some great articles. Any other questions before moving on? So this is a basic introduction into critical Islamic studies. Now, when it comes to apologetics, which is why most of you are here, we have to understand what this all means. Now, we're not going to be dumping critical Islamic studies on a Muslim we encounter. But it is important to be conversant with the various approaches here. We should not be led down rabbit holes. Often when we talk about hadith and isnad and all that, we often get led down a track where we're kind of on faulty ground to begin with. We begin arguing matan and isnad, and we begin arguing grading, and we're basically playing on the Muslim scholar's turf, which is very shaky to begin with. Now, we can play there. We can play on that field if we want, but we should do that knowingly. That should be a knowing decision that we make. We must be intentional about that. In actuality, the situation might be very different. I myself have not concluded what is stronger here. I do not think it very compelling that the Quran was written centuries after it was assumed to have been written. I don't think it compelling, but I do think it brings a lot of interesting questions to light. So this descriptive approach that we talked about at the beginning, it has a lot of relational utility. When you're talking to a Muslim and they really care about the hadith, they really care about the traditions, it would be good for you to be conversant with those traditions. If someone brings up a fact, for example, they talk about Jesus, and they say, how is it possible that Jesus could take the sin of man onto himself? Is that not unfair? Shouldn't each man suffer for himself? It is helpful to be able to point to Sahih Muslim and say, look, in Sahih Muslim, Allah says that sins can be transferred from one group to another. It helps to be able to do that. Now, is Sahih Muslim accurate? Who knows? But the Muslim you're speaking with probably thinks it is. And so that helps build a bridge there. It helps give you an argument. There are a lot of things like that where it'd be good to be able to recount certain hadith that can build your position, especially since that's where they are right now. But it's important to have these other approaches because they have scholastic utility. It gives you a better understanding of Islam. It gives you a better picture of what probably actually happened, or the degree of certainty which we can have. People who stay with the descriptive approach, I've noticed, often become confused as far as the level of certainty they can have. They think they really know Muhammad's life and how things happened, but you really can't know it that well given the sources. Which is a good segue to start looking at the historical Muhammad. Now that we understand scholarship, we understand the basic problems, let's take a look at Muhammad's life. We'll first start off by looking at the sources on his life. These are not comprehensive, but they are the most important that I could find. We start with Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq. Now, I mentioned it yesterday. Somebody had a copy. I saw it floating around. Let me borrow that from you. Thanks. So as you can see, it's a fairly thick book. This is a man by the name of Alfred Guillaume translating Ibn Ishaq. Now understand, Ibn Ishaq, as we have it today, is actually a recension. It's an edited version. Ibn Ishaq wrote, he died approximately 770 AD, and then a man by the name of Ibn Hisham collected his work. Ibn Hisham goes through the work and he writes an introduction, and in the introduction he says that he edited the work. He took certain parts out that he found were unbelievable, and he left the rest. So we know that Ibn Hisham has edited this work. What we have then is a translation of a recension of Ibn Ishaq. You can buy this off Amazon, and you can also find it online. I've seen whole transcripts online for free, though they are hard to find. If you want to read it to get an understanding of the earliest biography, people in the class got a link to the abridged version of this work. So someone has put an abridged version online. If you get the curriculum for this class, you'll find a link to that abridged version. I would suggest you read it. I think if you are interested in knowing Muhammad's life from an early Muslim perspective, you should read the book, either this one or the abridged version, to get an idea of what Muslims thought about Muhammad early on. It's very, very different from what Muslims think about Muhammad today. So get a good understanding of that. That will help you in your discussions. Thank you, sir. So, earliest biography we have, Sirat Rasulullah, Ibn Ishaq, very important. Now, what do Muslims think about Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasulullah? Well, they don't like it, often, especially Muslims in the West, because it says so much that is not flattering about Muhammad. It's not alone in doing that, but Western scholars, well, not necessarily scholars, but Western apologists especially, have turned to Ibn Ishaq because it is the earliest biography, and they've pulled a lot out of there to show Muslims what it says, and they have reacted negatively to it. A lot of these other sources say similar things. So there might be utility in going to the other sources, surely because it hasn't been rejected as much by Muslims today. The second source here is fairly well respected by Muslims. It's called Muwatta Imam Malik. This source is written approximately, Imam Malik died in 795, so we don't know exactly when it was written, but no later than 795. Some people say it may have been as early as 770. That's still up for grabs. Another early source is Al-Waqdi's Kitab al-Maghazi. Al-Waqdi had written a lot of works on Muhammad's life, but only one remains, and that's this book. And this book specifically focuses on the battles of Muhammad, the raids mostly, the early raids that happened before the Battle of Badr. So reading Al-Waqdi's work will give you a very, very early insight into the Ghazwat Rasul, the raids of the Prophet. Ibn Sa'd also wrote an early biography of Muhammad in Kitab al-Tabaqat. Very interesting stuff found there, and we're still talking about books written before the most trustworthy hadith. So these three books, apart from Sirat Rasulullah, are the earliest works on Muhammad. They predate the ahadith collections that we have that are considered the most authentic.
Which day?
I'm sorry?
Which day?
Well, the top four. Yeah. Muwatta Imam Malik is actually a book of traditions as well, so it is a hadith book for the most part, but it deals specifically with jurisprudence. He was commissioned to write it for the purpose of law, recording some principles of law. And so you don't learn a lot about Muhammad's life through it, you learn more about commands on law. Whereas the other three are books about Muhammad's life. So, just to clarify, Sirat Rasulullah, a biography, it's a sira. Muwatta is a hadith, but focusing on jurisprudence. And then Kitab al-Maghazi and Kitab al-Tabaqat are both books on sira, on biography. After this is when you get the first book of hadith that Muslims consider trustworthy. And by Muslims, I mean Sunni Muslims. You get Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim. Now, Sahih al-Bukhari was written by Imam Bukhari, so it's called the Sahih, the authentic hadith, collected by Imam Bukhari. Imam Bukhari is reputed to have gone through hundreds of thousands of hadith. Depending on the source you read, some will say 500,000, some will say 300,000, some will say 700,000. But he went through hundreds of thousands of hadith, according to the Muslims, and he sifted through each one in order to determine how authentic and accurate it was. That process, by the way, is what gave it the title Sahih. What he would do, according to Muslims, is he would travel to the person who was relaying the hadith. And so if someone is in the isnad, right, the chain of transmission, if someone were in that chain of transmission and were still alive, he would travel to that person. And he would say, tell me the hadith as you have heard it. And the person would recite it. And he'd say, who told it to you? And he would recount the chain of transmission from that person. If it matched, he would then say that this is authentic. He would also go through the chain of transmission and he would look at the life of every person in that chain. And he would see, was this person a truthful person? Was he an honest person? Or did he have a reputation for scheming and lying? If he had a bad reputation, he would discredit the hadith, he wouldn't include it. It is said that he went so far in determining whether someone was accurate in their recounting of the hadith, that if he would go to a person to learn about a hadith and he saw that person mistreating an animal, he would immediately discredit that person and say that this hadith is not trustworthy because it's coming from an untrustworthy person. Here's a person who doesn't take care of animals. How do we know he would take care of something like a hadith? So Imam Bukhari, extremely well respected among Sunnis. To put it colloquially, is if it's in Sahih Bukhari, most Muslims consider it good as gold. Now, Imam Bukhari had a student named Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim produced Sahih al-Muslim. And so Sahih al-Muslim is considered by Muslims to be the next most trustworthy book of hadith. Now we can't, historically speaking, we can't say this is independent of Bukhari because we know it's his student. He was learning directly from Bukhari, so most of what you find in Muslim, if it's also in Bukhari, we can know came from Bukhari. However, Muslims don't see it that way, and if they see a hadith in both Muslim and Bukhari, they think it is as strong as any hadith could possibly be. Not Muslim scholars per se, but the lay Muslim sees it that way. Imam Muslim didn't live long after Imam Bukhari. He died about 5 years later. But you can find all of Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari exists in 9 volumes. You can find it all on sahihbukhari.com. Again, there's no isnad there, just the matan. And you can find all of Sahih al-Muslim as well. You will find that there are different numbering systems used online. People are trying to codify the numbering systems, and now mostly what people I've seen are using, for Sahih al-Bukhari, they're using volume, book, and hadith number. So you'll see 3 numbers for Sahih Bukhari. The first number is for volume, the second is for book, the third is for hadith number. You might still find the old numbering, which is just a number, and you'll find it in the thousands. But they're trying to change that. Sahih al-Muslim is by book and by number. So you'll see 2 numbers there usually. To end the story, Imam Bukhari took these 5, 7, 300,000 hadith and whittled them down to 5,000. So according to most Muslims, they would agree that Imam Bukhari threw out about 99% of the hadith he came across. Very interesting. Yep.
What's an imam?
So that's a good question. An imam is basically a leader. You don't have the same clerical status that you had in Catholic Christianity at the time. People weren't ordained per se. If you were learned and you stood out amongst the Muslims around you, you'd easily be called an imam. Now, if you did go through some rigorous training, you could gain other titles, like sheikh, but an imam is pretty much a learned person. That's not to say that Bukhari was not extremely learned. He was. But the title itself does not imply necessarily a lot of learning. It just implies that he is considered a leader amongst the community. Good question. In the back.
This seems to be based, especially on the hadiths, on a lot of human judgment. And just want to make sure that Muslims do not put any divine inspiration on it.
The Imam, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim comes close. They wouldn't say it's divinely inspired, but they would say that these imams collected Muhammad's words and actions very accurately, and Muhammad's words and actions were essentially inspired. So in that sense, indirectly, yeah, most Sunni Muslims would consider Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim as good as gold. But I don't know a single Muslim who would say they're divinely inspired.
Isn't it necessary to contrast the level of inspiration? If a hadith isn't divinely inspired, why wouldn't it be Quran?
Right, so that's why I'm pointing out that no one would say it's divinely inspired, but they would say that if it accurately reflects what Muhammad said and did, Muhammad's actions and sayings are so close to divinely inspired that we can trust what they say. Now that's not to say that there are some hadith that Muslims think are divinely inspired. There's a few hadith that Muslims consider that came directly from Allah to Muhammad as divine revelation that was not supposed to be included in the Quran. Those hadith are called Hadith Qudsi, Qudsi, Hadith Qudsi. That's very interesting. We're going to talk about that briefly as we get into the Quran. So there are some hadith that Muslims consider divinely inspired, but the vast majority of these, no. The question is, did they come from Muhammad or not? And if they did, they are almost as good as that. Hey, David, could you do me a favor? So when people ask questions, I don't think it gets into the recording. So if I forget to restate the question for the recording, let me know. You got it? All right. JW.
You said that essentially Bukhari, or I'm not sure I'm saying that right, threw out the other ones. Does that mean like they were, a lot of them were written down